If you want muscle, you need to improve. You need progressive overload. Real change only happens when you're willing to push yourself to the very edge of what you're capable of over and over again for many months and years. The usual forms of progressive overload are clear to see and easy to understand. One way to overload your body is by adding reps to your exercises. Benching 135 for 5 in week 1, for 6 in week 2, and 7 in week 3 is simple data. Every week you force your body to handle progressively more challenging sets, so it adapts. The other basic form of progressive overload is adding weight. Benching 135 for 5 in week 1, 140 for 5 in week 2, and 145 for 5 in week 3 makes sense. These things are easy to understand. But what about other, less obvious forms of progressive overload? What about time? I've made plenty of videos now discussing the effectiveness of time as an alternative to basic sets and reps, and I'm proud to say most of you have been willing to accept it. Many of you have even reported back with positive feedback after trying it yourself. Even so, there are always a few who can't seem to understand the idea. What that tells me is I just need to do a better job at explaining the concept, so that's what I hope to do. Today, let's discuss how time is just as much a viable form of progressive overload as adding weight or reps. First, let me give you a quick example of how I use time to build muscle, then I'll try to uncover the reasoning behind it. My favorite way to do this is with Calisthenics Circuits. Let's say a circuit is made up of 50 pull-ups, 50 pike push-ups, and 50 ab wheel rollouts. At the start of my workout, I'll set a timer and track how long it takes me to complete every rep. Let's say it takes 15 minutes. With that base set, all I have to do is come in next time and complete those reps in 14 minutes and 59 seconds or less, and progressive overload will have taken place. By completing all 150 reps in less time, the body will have had to work harder than it did last time. That's it. It takes more strength to lift 135 for 6 reps than 5, 145 for 5 takes more strength than 135 for 5, and completing that circuit in 14 minutes and 59 seconds took more strength than it did to do it in 15 minutes. Spelled out like that, it should be pretty clear why this works, but that clarity is often short-lived. What happens is, maybe you're willing to accept it initially, but then you start really thinking about it, and all these red flags start showing up. But you didn't actually do any more reps. You didn't lift more weight. How could that work? Won't this just lead to endless junk volume? This is a simple matter of conditioning and exposure. There are very few people out there who use time to overload the body in a bodybuilding setting. Nearly everyone uses sets and reps, so it can be difficult to disconnect from that. But there's more to physical exercise than just bodybuilding for the sake of itself. When you branch out into other sports, you actually see this time approach used very often. The first example I can give you is sprinting. Sprinters don't progressively overload by running further, or by adding reps, you could say. Most of them don't add weight to their bodies during their sprints either, at least not most of the time, so weight is out of the picture too. How is it that sprinters build such impressive bodies? Simple, they run faster. The 100-yard dash is constant and unchanging. The only change is how quickly the sprinter completes the race. The sprinter builds muscle by racing the clock. This is the exact same concept used in that calisthenics circuit I outlined earlier, only rather than a 100-yard dash, with the calisthenics circuit it's a couple hundred reps. Another example I can give you is CrossFit. Obviously, there's a lot going on with it, but one of the fundamental things that lies at the heart of the sport is the WOD, or workout of the day. I can't claim to be an expert in CrossFit, and not every WOD functions in the same way, but one of the most popular workouts is Murph, which is a 1-mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and another 1-mile run. It's always the same. The workout is constant. You improve by completing the workout in less time. Some add weight too, which shows this doesn't need to be completely one-dimensional. You can go back and forth between multiple forms of progressive overload if you want. You don't need to stick with just one. But at the end of the day, these CrossFit workouts are a race, just like sprinting, just like the calisthenics circuit. As much hate as they may get, as counterintuitive as it may be to pair this time approach with heavy technical skill-based movements like a snatch or a clean and jerk, no one can deny how absolutely jacked CrossFit athletes are. A final example I'll give you is the idea of density training. This is outlined in great detail in the 2005 book written by Charles Staley titled Escalating Density Training, but essentially this form of exercise seeks to increase workout density by doing more work in less time. Again, this model uses time as its form of progressive overload, but the main reason I wanted to include it here is because it approaches the idea from a different angle, which should give more substance to the main topic of today's video. Where the previous example sought to do a set amount of work in less time, density training has you doing more work in the same time. A calisthenics circuit might be 150 reps as quickly as possible. A density workout might be as many reps as you can in 10 minutes. In some ways, these two things are different, but in many other ways, they're the same thing. Both use time as the main variable, and both lead to increased muscle mass. How much can you get done, and how quickly can you do it? How fast can you sprint? How many reps can you do without stopping to catch your breath? There's no denying the effectiveness of this training style. It works for me, it works for the sprinters and the CrossFitters, it works for Charles Staley and those who use his methods. Now, I want to talk about the real secret behind using time as a form of progressive overload. The truth is, time isn't actually much different than just adding weight to an exercise. It's just less obvious to see. Let's look again at the sprinter. How does a sprinter take his 100-yard dash from 15 seconds to 14? He runs faster. But how does he run faster? Well, he puts more force into the ground with every stride. I think the math is a bit more complicated than this, but just for the sake of explaining my point, let's say a sprinter puts 500 pounds of force into the ground with every stride, and it takes him 15 seconds to complete the 100-yard dash. Of course, technique plays a role, but one way he might reach 14 seconds is instead by putting 600 pounds of force into the ground with every stride. This is basic strength gain. This is still just the basic concept of adding weight to your exercises as a means of progressively overloading the body. The problem is tracking that progress more than anything. Adding weight to an exercise is right there out in the open for everyone to see. Lifting the same weight more forcefully isn't always noticeable at first glance. Unless you have some futuristic track that monitors how much force is put into the ground with every step, you'll just have to accept that a faster time means a stronger sprinter. The connection between time and strength becomes even less obvious with something like a 150-rep calisthenics circuit, because the workout is stretched out over a much longer period of time. The improvement to each rep is so minor, it's nearly impossible to see, but the same idea applies. To do that circuit in less time, eventually, you will need to put more force into every rep. You will need to get stronger. Strength plays a big role in this time approach, but there's more to it. The other thing that makes this work has to do with fatigue. In bodybuilding, the idea of pre-exhausting a muscle as a way to reach failure in fewer reps is very common. There is also the idea of placing the exercises you're strongest at near the end of a workout rather than at the start, because you'll already be fatigued by the time you get to them and won't need to use as much weight to reach failure, thus reducing the overall fatigue generated by an exercise. In both examples, it becomes clear it's not necessarily the weight itself that matters for muscle growth, but reaching failure, regardless of how many reps it takes to get there. This same thing applies to the timed calisthenics circuit. Maybe you can do 10 pull-ups completely fresh, but how many can you do after already completing 25 pull-ups, 25 pike push-ups, and 25 ab wheel rollouts? It would take considerably more effort to reach 10 reps again at that point. And that's just for starters. The question will eventually become, how many pull-ups can you do after already doing 200 reps? Maybe only 2 or 3, so that's what you do, and you just keep going, pushing to failure over and over again. When you're already fatigued, it doesn't take much to push an exercise to failure. I think I've made some solid arguments for why time works as a viable form of progressive overload. Now let's answer the question of why. If it's so effective, why don't more people use it? And why would you choose time over something more basic, like simply adding reps or weight to basic exercises? Well, the first question is easy. Why don't more people do it? Partly because they probably just aren't aware of it, but mostly because it's hard. Way harder than straight sets. Using time to force progressive overload takes every bit of willpower you have. It's never easy. It forces you to push well beyond the point you'd ever get to using basic sets and reps. And as much as people are willing to put in the work needed to build muscle, most don't want to put in this much work. It's much easier to just add 5 pounds to the bar and continue on, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'd be lying if I said there weren't days where these calisthenics circuits are a real drag. It takes a lot of mental effort to train this way, which is actually a big part of why it's so effective, but still, sometimes it just feels plain mean. Now on to the other question. Why choose time over other forms of progressive overload? Well, you could make a few different arguments, but to me, it comes down to one thing: endurance. There is a huge endurance component to training this way. Using time lets you build endurance and strength and muscle all in the same workout, and I think that's awesome. Sure, you could do basic straight sets followed by some cardio and end up in kinda the same place, but combining cardio and strength training together in this way creates something that's far greater than the sum of its parts. 1 + 1 = 5, you might say. You become so conditioned you'll run circles around those guys who train in the normal way, and you'll build just as much muscle as they do too. Again, this isn't necessary, but I think the extra conditioning benefits are well worth it. Finally, let me just say I think there are many instances where using time isn't the best idea. It works great for bodyweight exercise, push-ups, pull-ups, sprinting. It can work great for machine-based workouts or low-risk movements like isolation work, but in my opinion, I would never use this for heavy compound movements. Trying for max reps in 10 minutes with something like a clean and press is a recipe for disaster and injury at worst, and at best you'll probably end up ruining your technique and developing bad habits pushing through fatigue with such a technical movement. You might be able to make it through unscathed. Some people swear by this approach, but I don't believe the risk is worth the reward. And that's all I have. Would you consider trying these timed calisthenics circuits, or just using time as a variable rather than always adding more weight or reps? I'm interested to hear your opinion on the topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.